In this episode, we take the guiding principles you learned about and bring them down into a practical governance skill, selecting the right type of policy document for the job so people know what is expected without guessing. A lot of security frustration comes from using the wrong kind of document to communicate a requirement, like writing a long, high-level policy when what people really needed was a clear procedure, or writing a detailed technical standard when what leadership needed was a principle-driven rule. When the type is wrong, ambiguity increases, teams interpret the requirement differently, and everyone ends up reworking the same conversations again and again. That wastes time, but it also increases risk because inconsistent interpretations create gaps and workarounds. Choosing the right policy type is a way of reducing confusion before it happens, because the document itself sets expectations about what it is and how it should be used. For brand new learners, this matters because security governance is not just about what you decide, but how you express it so the organization can actually follow it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to understand that policy documents exist on a spectrum from broad intent to detailed execution, and each point on that spectrum has a different purpose. At the broad end, policies express what the organization requires and why it requires it, usually tied back to principles and risk. At the detailed end, procedures describe exactly how to carry out a task in day-to-day operations. In between, you often find standards and guidelines, which help translate policy intent into consistent practices without dictating every keystroke. The reason this spectrum matters is that people need different levels of detail depending on their role. Leaders need clarity about requirements, accountability, and outcomes, while implementers need clarity about steps and decision points. If you give leaders a procedure, they may get lost in details and miss the required outcome. If you give implementers a broad policy, they may not know what to do and will invent their own methods. The right policy type matches the user's need and reduces the chance of misinterpretation. A policy, in the strict sense, is a statement of mandatory intent, meaning it describes what must be true in the organization. Policies typically define scope, responsibilities, and enforcement expectations, and they are often written to endure across time. A policy is not meant to teach every operational detail. It is meant to establish a requirement and provide the authority to enforce it. For example, a policy might state that sensitive data must be protected from unauthorized access and that access must be granted based on business need. That policy sets a non-negotiable expectation without prescribing the exact technical method. The benefit of a policy is that it is stable and can be referenced when decisions are challenged. The risk of relying on policy alone is that it can feel abstract, which is why policies usually need companion documents that help people implement the requirement consistently. On an exam, when a question asks what document establishes mandatory requirements, policy is often the right direction. A standard is typically more specific than a policy, and its job is to reduce variation by defining required characteristics, methods, or thresholds. Standards take policy intent and turn it into consistent expectations, such as minimum password length rules, logging requirements, encryption requirements, or retention periods. The key idea is that standards are still mandatory, but they are closer to implementation than policy. They exist because many security outcomes require consistency, and consistency is hard when every team chooses a different approach. Standards also make compliance measurable because you can assess whether a system meets the standard. The risk is that standards can become brittle if they are tied too closely to a particular technology or if they are not maintained as the environment changes. That is why standards should still be grounded in principles, and why they often need review cadence. When a question emphasizes uniform requirements across systems, think of a standard rather than a high-level policy. A procedure is different because it describes how to perform a task, often in an ordered way that supports day-to-day operations. Procedures exist to make work repeatable and safe, especially when tasks are complex, high risk, or need to be done consistently by different people. In a security context, Procedures might describe how to handle access requests, how to respond to an alert, how to perform a backup verification, or how to approve changes during an incident. Procedures are usually more time-sensitive than policies because workflows change, and procedures must match reality to be followed. If a procedure is unrealistic, people will skip it, and then the organization loses both safety and consistency. Procedures also reduce rework because they prevent teams from reinventing the same steps every time a task occurs. On exam questions that focus on stepwise operational execution, procedure is often the right category, even if the question does not explicitly use that word. Guidelines are usually recommended practices rather than mandatory requirements, and they exist to help people make good choices without requiring a single rigid method. Guidelines can be useful when there are multiple valid ways to meet a goal, or when the organization wants to encourage a best practice but cannot enforce it universally due to varied contexts. For example, a guideline might suggest secure coding practices, recommended logging patterns, or preferred ways of documenting exceptions. The power of a guideline is that it supports learning and improvement without creating a compliance trap. The weakness is that guidelines alone do not guarantee protection because people may ignore recommendations when pressured. That means guidelines should not be used when the outcome is truly non-negotiable. A good governance system uses guidelines to reduce variation in low-risk areas while reserving mandatory documents for high-risk areas. On an exam, when the question implies flexibility and recommendations rather than enforcement, guideline is often the best fit. Another policy type you may hear discussed is a baseline, which is a defined minimum set of controls or configurations expected for a category of systems. A baseline is a way of saying this is the starting point, and you can do more if needed, but you cannot do less without justification. Baselines are helpful because they create a consistent floor of protection and reduce debate over what is acceptable. They also reduce rework because teams do not have to renegotiate basic expectations for every new system. In many environments, baselines are paired with standards and procedures, where the baseline defines minimum control presence and the standards define required characteristics. The key for beginner understanding is that baselines are about minimum acceptable posture for a class of assets, not about one-off exceptions. When a question asks about defining a minimum set of protections for all systems in a group, baseline is a strong concept to consider. Choosing the right policy type reduces ambiguity because it tells the reader whether they are looking at a requirement, a recommended practice, or a step-by-step method. Many policy problems happen when documents mix these signals, like when a policy uses soft language that sounds optional even though it is meant to be mandatory, or when a guideline includes hard requirements but is presented as advice. Another source of confusion is when a procedure contains policy-level statements, which causes people to debate the requirement every time they try to execute it. The fix is to keep document types clean and to link them clearly, so policy states the mandate, standards define required characteristics, procedures define the operational steps, and guidelines offer optional best practices. When these types are used correctly, questions like who decides, what must be done, and how it is done become easier to answer. That clarity reduces the number of meetings needed to interpret requirements and reduces the chance of inconsistent decisions. In security, reducing ambiguity is itself a protective control because ambiguity creates exploitable gaps. It is also important to select policy types based on how often the content changes, because durability should match the document's intended lifespan. Policies should be relatively stable, changing only when principles, risk tolerance, or major organizational needs change. Procedures may change more frequently as workflows evolve, systems are replaced, or teams reorganize. Standards sit in the middle, because they may change as threats evolve and as best practices shift, but they should not churn so frequently that teams cannot keep up. Guidelines can evolve even more flexibly because they are about recommendations and continuous improvement. If you put fast-changing details into a slow-changing policy, the policy becomes outdated and loses credibility. If you put slow-changing mandates into a fast-changing procedure, you risk accidental erosion when the procedure is updated. Matching the document type to the rate of change is one of the most practical ways to reduce rework over time. Another aspect of choosing the right policy type is thinking about enforceability and measurement. because different types lend themselves to different forms of accountability. Policies and standards are typically enforceable, meaning noncompliance can trigger corrective action, while procedures are enforceable in the sense that they define the required steps for a process. Guidelines are usually not enforced, but they can be encouraged and tracked as maturity improves. Measurement fits differently too, because policies might be measured through compliance assessments, standards through technical checks or reviews, and procedures through operational performance and audit trails. If you choose the wrong type, you may end up with requirements that cannot be measured or measured activities that do not connect to outcomes. Good governance is decision-ready, which means you can tell whether the organization is meeting expectations and what to do if it is not. Policy types are part of building that decision-ready system. For exam thinking, when questions emphasize accountability, enforceability, or auditability, you should lean toward document types that create clear obligations. To reduce ambiguity even further, policy types should be written in language that matches their intent, because wording signals whether something is required or optional. Mandatory documents should use clear directive language that leaves little room for interpretation, while guidelines should use recommendation language that encourages best practice without implying enforcement. Confusion happens when people see soft language in a mandatory document and treat it as optional, or when they see hard language in a guideline and assume it carries policy weight. Another problem is inconsistent definitions, where different documents use the same term differently, which creates endless rework as teams debate what the words mean. This is why good governance often includes common definitions and consistent naming, so readers can move between documents without translation. When document types and language align, the organization spends less time interpreting and more time executing. That is the real payoff of choosing the right policy types. As we close, the big idea is that policy success is not only about what you require, but about how clearly you communicate requirements through the right kind of document. Policies define mandatory intent. Standards define required characteristics and reduce variation. Procedures define repeatable operational steps. Guidelines offer recommended practices, and baselines define minimum posture for categories of assets. When you match the policy type to the need, you reduce ambiguity, reduce rework, and reduce the chance that security intent gets lost in translation. For brand new learners, this is an empowering skill because it gives you a way to diagnose governance problems. If teams are confused, ask whether they were given the right type of document and whether the intent of the document matches its language. When governance is designed well, it feels less like bureaucracy and more like clarity, because people know what is expected and how to do it. In security, clarity is not just convenience. It is control, because clear expectations are harder to bypass and easier to verify. Choosing the right policy types is one of the simplest ways to make security durable and actionable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.